Hello, we now move on to the uh, 25th module of the course in applied linguistics, which is a part of the e-Pathshala program of the UGC in linguistics. And this 25th module is concerned with a very important aspect of applied linguistics, which is now being increasingly uh, explored in more and more detail and with more and more advantages to the teachers, teacher trainers, and to children. This is the interface between language and education. Now, we have talked about materials, methods, learning theories, assessment, and various aspects of applied linguistics, particularly in the context of language teaching. Uh, the There are two important things about language in the context of education. One is that whatever be the domain of knowledge, irrespective of it is physics, chemistry, maths, social sciences, literature, dance, aesthetics, whatever, it language cuts across all of them. So transmission of knowledge and creation of knowledge, building of any kind of understanding is almost inconceivable without language. So in that sense, language is of fundamental importance. That is one aspect. The second aspect, which a leading linguist like Michael Halliday emphasized, is that if we can crack the question of the acquisition of language, then we will be able to crack the processes through which children acquire knowledge. Because this is something that people don't appreciate, that language is a kind of knowledge, is a kind of knowledge system, but a kind of knowledge system which children construct effortlessly and subconsciously. And that system is there, and it gets articulated in different situations. If there is time, they can't state the rules that they have, but there is overwhelming, incontrovertible evidence that they at some level know those rules. So that is why I think language is, these are two major reasons for which language is of such central significance in the case of education. And the third aspect, because of which I think language, when seen as multilinguality, as I have been talking about it in this course and elsewhere, where we say that multilingualism available in the class can be used as a resource, one of the things that can be done during that process is to do in a sort of very miniature way what linguists normally do. Compare, elicit data, classify it, categorize it, build hypotheses about the data, make rules, verify the rules. So the whole process of verifiability, demonstrability, arguments against the particular rule and modification of rules, all these can be done about all the languages available in the classroom. So I think if you keep these 3 points in mind, and a few more that we are going to discuss in this module, I think you will realize how important is this interface between language and education. You see, the unfortunate thing is that although school is a kind of mini society, school is a kind of reflection of the society in various aspects in terms of caste, color, creed, socioeconomic background, different dimensions of children, different different levels of abilities, different kinds of abilities. So all these get together in the school. But on the other hand, there is a major disjunction between home and school, between street and school. The disjunction is also in terms of language. The language of home, perhaps in over 70, 85, 80% cases, is not the language of the home or the languages of home, it is some other language. So that is the first major disjunction that takes place. Again, the systems of knowledge and cultural practices that are a part of the community are not a part of the school curriculum. Okay. There is certainly, to some extent, that these things can be brought into the classroom. As I said, through multilinguality and using multilingualism as a resource, we can certainly bring in the languages of children into the classroom. Similarly, maybe certain other skills, certain other cultural practices, social practices, which are also full of diversity, can also be brought into the classroom, and teachers and children and the curriculum, classroom processes can benefit from it. But we also need to realize, on the other hand, that school ultimately is a formal structure. Okay. And a formal structure in terms of, there is a head or the principal, there is a timetable. Timetable has certain periods, certain slots. There are books, there are materials, and there are forms of specific kinds of knowledge. And each domain of knowledge with its own assumptions, with its own verifiable verification criteria, and with its own methodology. See, the kind of methodology that you use in science, you do not use in mathematics. The kind you use in sciences, you don't use in social science. So there are different kinds of methodology, different kinds of assumptions, and different kinds of validation criteria which will prove, which will show whether what you have said and what you claim is accurate or not, whether it is true or it is false, or whether it is justified or not. So children need to be exposed to all those systems of knowledge, and they may not be transacted in the society in as scientific a way as they have to be done in the formal space. So there is this disjunction which we have to sort of negotiate, but we need to appreciate that over this whole architecture of the school, there is the arc of language which cuts across from the beginning to the end. And this arc of language, which I have been trying to explain from the beginning of this course, is, on the one hand, highly rule-governed, very close to a universal grammar blueprint, and on the other hand, very fluid, highly variable, highly diverse. And in the classroom, it is present in all its manifestations. So we need to negotiate that. And there is a very strong need to accommodate this diversity, because there is richness in diversity. There is sort of vacuum in homogeneity. If imagine if all the trees and plants in a forest were to look the same. Imagine that all the children were to look the same. So that makes it very boring, and that's not what we want. We want to maintain the diversity, and we want to make use of that diversity. It should not be the case that languages of home and the languages of the school should be so characterized that they lead to discrimination and they lead to humiliation, which is very often the case. Even as celebrated social scientist as Basil Bernstein made a distinction between restricted code and elaborated code. And he presented a case of fait accompli. What was the fait accompli? That restricted code is a product of the lower class, elaborated code is the product of the middle class. And all educational transactions take place in the elaborated code. So, the lower class will remain the lower class and the middle class will remain the middle class. Now, this kind of distinction, is killing, is highly humiliating. And it took a person like Lebov to show that restricted codes are as systematic, as elaborate as the so-called elaborate code. It just so happens that the elaborate code or the middle class language, as it were, becomes the prestigious language and the language of education and the language of school curriculum. So the idea is not to eliminate the restricted code, but and privilege the elaborated code more and more, but to privilege the languages of all the children in such a way that they become a part of the classroom diversity and we can make use of it. We have so far been governed by a myth of monolinguality. So, elaborated code was another kind of monolinguality, and that dictates the paradigm of a teacher, a school, a classroom, a language, and a textbook. Now, this is dangerous. This is highly dangerous, because if you want to entertain and sustain diversity, then this will not work. So we need to think about a new kind of paradigm which is rooted in multilinguality. We need to think of a new kind of pedagogy which is rooted in multilinguality. And if you see the next slide on your screen, there is a slide on your screen, the advantages of multilinguality now have very solid research evidence. And the kind of paradigm that I am talking about, which is rooted in multilinguality, and that means in the languages of the children, and all the languages that one, or you might say in more simple words, that in the verbal repertoire of children, all the linguistic choices that children can make, it's rooted there. And if you look at the slide on your screen, you will see that it has now been shown by very intensive research that it has major cognitive advantages, as shown by Hudson. It has great advantages in enhancing your metalinguistic awareness. Metalinguistic awareness means that your critical faculties about reflecting on language rather than just using language become very important. And the moment you have higher metalinguistic awareness, Bailey Stock showed, your levels of proficiency go up. I think these are important issues. Your communicative sensitivity goes up. Genesee and his colleagues showed. There is greater intergroup understanding. That means the levels of social tolerance go up. This is what Jim Cummins showed. And what happens is that when my language, which is otherwise discriminated and stigmatized, and I often feel humiliated because I come from a tribal area, or I come from a marginal group, or I speak a kind of accent or variety which other people laugh at. But once that language is privileged in the classroom and is shown to be as systematic as other languages, then my self-esteem increases. And this was shown by Jim Cummins. So, as you can appreciate, the standard monolingual paradigm, mono-class, mono-teacher, mono-child paradigm ensures that the status quo will be maintained and it will be reproduced. There will be no change. So, the elite rule at the time and they will continue to rule. The marginalized people will get further marginalized and will, as you see, what is happening these days, that marginalized people are being pushed more to the margins, and those groups include girls, they include minorities, they include people with various kinds of disability. All these groups are being pushed to the margin because elite monopolizes all the resources. So if you agree, if you think what I am saying is rational, you will create spaces for multilinguality. You will create spaces for a pedagogy rooted in multilinguality. I have already given some examples of that, and in a later module we will talk in greater detail about it, and that this is the only space in the school structure and perhaps in the society which can create spaces for the subversion of the status quo. You see, any system of education, any perspective on language, unless it also thinks of human welfare in general, human welfare of the whole community, I think is not worthwhile. So it is in that perspective that I am saying that we must honor and use multilinguality in our educational discourse. And this is the major thrust of the interface, so far I am concerned, between the language and education area of applied linguistics. Thank you very much.